Hello, everybody. Hello, everyone. I will be brief. I'm sure I do not want to subject everyone to my sick voice. I've been hearing that we're going to make America healthy again, but I clearly did not get the memo on that one. So I do apologize for that. It's at a college campus, and many things get passed around a college campus. So I unfortunately caught one of those. My name is Zach Gardner, and I am the president of the Princeton Open Campus Coalition. We are an undergraduate student organization that is dedicated to fostering a campus environment here at Princeton that is free of fear and intolerance. We value dialogue as our greatest tool and truth seeking as our ultimate aim. If you have any questions about the POCC or would like to be added to our email list, feel free to email me at zachgardner@princeton.edu. There's also some flyers out in the lobby, and you can scan the QR code and submit some suggestions and submit your name so you can get on the email list. We would like to give our warmest welcome to the Steamboat Institute and Princetonians for Free Speech, who have both graciously supported this event, so thank you so much. It is because of supporters like you that we can bring great events like this to campus and bring unique, impactful ideas to a place that sometimes might not always get to hear them. I would also like to thank Dean Deese. I don't know if he's in the audience, but he's been a great support in helping us get this event off the ground as well, so I'd like to thank him. It is great to be at a university that does value free speech as one of its core ideas. And with that, I'd like to introduce it to one of our great supporters, Angela Smith, the Executive Director of Princetonians for Free Speech.
Good evening. I think my sick voice has mostly passed. I am Angela Smith. I have the privilege of serving as the executive director for Princetonians for Free Speech. We are a nonprofit organization. We empower and educate a nonpartisan group of alumni who are passionate about free speech, free expression, academic freedom, and viewpoint diversity issues here on the Princeton campus. We particularly work with alumni, so if there's any Princeton alumni in the audience, we would be particularly interested in talking with you. But of course, our work extends to everybody who's concerned about those issues here on the Princeton campus. So I will keep it at that. We have a website. Feel free to come find myself or my colleague Kaylee, who is here. And with that, I'm going to welcome up Hadley Manning, who is the EVP at Steamboat Institute.
Good evening. Thank you, Zach and Angela, for such a warm welcome to the Princeton campus. Thank you to all of you for coming out tonight. It's great to see so many students and members of the community here. And thank you also to those of you who are watching on our live stream on the Steamboat Institute YouTube channel. Tonight's debate is the first stop in the spring 2025 edition of our Campus Liberty Tour debate series. This spring, we are visiting 5 campuses with a unique debate topic at each location. You can view the full debate schedule, including topics and speakers, at steamboatinstitute.org, and you can watch any of our previous debate videos there as well. As with all of our debates, tonight the emphasis is on civility and showing students and all who attend how to think, not what to think. As a nonprofit, nonpartisan organization, Steamboat Institute relies on the support of many generous individuals and foundations to bring programs such as tonight's debate to audiences across the country. I would like to extend a special thank you to the Adolph Kors Foundation, the Diana Davis Spencer Foundation, the Linda and Harry Bradley Foundation, the Jack Roth Charitable Foundation, the Tina Snyder Foundation, and Bruce and Marcy Benson for their support, which is allowing us to expand this program to more campuses across America. Now, on to tonight's program. It's a good time to examine America's love affair with Israel, and not just because Valentine's Day is approaching. Global events and domestic political developments have pushed the U.S. Israel relationship to the forefront of American politics. Tonight's debate will explore the question, is the U.S. Israel alliance a strategic asset for American foreign policy? Now, we invite all of you in our audience to respond with your view on this question. Agree, disagree, or undecided before the debate begins, using the QR code or text link provided to you. We will then ask your opinion again after the debate is over to see if your opinions have changed. So please answer the pre-debate poll. We encourage you to do this now with your phones to make polling as representative as possible of the views of our audience. And those of you watching on the live stream will see a link in the chat where you can participate as well. Now it's my great pleasure to introduce our speakers and our moderator for this evening. Arguing the affirmative tonight is Josh Hammer. Josh is senior editor at large of Newsweek, a syndicated columnist, and a fellow with the Edmund Burke Foundation and the Palm Beach Freedom Institute. He also hosts the Josh Hammer Show, a Newsweek podcast and syndicated radio show. He's the author of the forthcoming book, due out March 18th, Israel and Civilization, The Fate of the Jewish Nation and the Destiny of the West. Arguing the negative tonight is Dave Smith. Dave is a comedian, political commentator, and radio and TV personality. He's a regular guest on the Joe Rogan Experience, Tim Pool, Kennedy, and the Greg Gutfeld Show. In 2017, Dave's debut comedy special, Libertas, was released and spent over 3 weeks at #1 on the iTunes comedy chart. Dave is the host of Part of the Problem, a libertarian podcast about current events and the evils of government and the corporate media. Our moderator for tonight is Tom Rogan. Tom's in an Uber about 5 minutes away. He faced some travel delays today, but Tom's a good friend and a senior Tony Blankley Fellow at the Steamboat Institute. He's also a foreign policy writer and editor for the Washington Examiner. He writes frequently on security and intelligence issues involving Russia, China, and the Middle East. So he will be the ideal moderator for tonight. Until then, I will get us started. But first, let's review the results from our pre-debate poll. You can see the results on the screen. About 29% of you say you agree. About 43% of you say you disagree. And about 28% are undecided. It's a great starting point. We're going to start with some opening statements from both Josh and then Dave. Each speaker will have 5 minutes. So Josh, the floor is yours.
Okay, well, thank you all, guys, all of you so much for organizing this wonderful event. It's actually my first time being here on campus at Princeton, so really, really nice to be here as well. So we only have 5 minutes each. I'm going to dive right in here, and if I start speaking quickly, that's just because we only have 5 minutes. So there's 3 basic reasons as to why the U.S. Israel relationship is in the strategic national interest of the United States, and I want to emphasize that is the entire issue that we are debating tonight. We are not debating any issues of pure unadulterated morality. We are not debating anything other than whether this relationship is in the strategic interest of the United States. So there are 3 main levels as to why this relationship works, and it redounds to the interest of the United States. There's the regional level, there's the global level, and there's a civilizational level. So I will basically go in order. At the regional level, I think it's important just to kind of lay out the groundwork here. We're talking about the Middle East. And as J.D. Vance said in a conference last May when he was just Senator J.D. Vance and not yet Vice President J.D. Vance, America is always going to have numerous reasons for caring about the Middle East. Yes, obviously, part of that is going to be because there are tens, if not hundreds of millions of people here who actually feel that there is some divine, biblical, genuine reason for caring about this tiny sliver of land in the Eastern Mediterranean there. But more than that, there is, of course, the issue of Islamic radicalism and Islamic terrorism. You actually don't have to go back that far to 9/11. We actually just saw that on the Bourbon Street massacre in the wee hours of the morning on January 1st, just a month and a half ago there, to see that Islamic radicalism very much remains a threat today. And then you also have the reality that there are various waterways there, such as the Red Sea, the Bab al-Mandab Strait, the Strait of Hormuz, the Persian Gulf. Roughly a quarter of the world's trade, if not more than that, flows through this part of the world. So for various reasons, the United States is always going to have some interest in the Middle East. The question is, how do we identify then allies on the ground who can better patrol this region in a way that redounds to the national interest? I would submit to you that if you look at the list of U.S. recognized FTOs, foreign terrorist organizations, to use the nomenclature of the United States State Department there, you will see that this list of FTOs includes organizations like Hamas, Palestinian Islamic Jihad, Hezbollah, Kataib Hezbollah in Syria and Iraq, the Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps, which was added by President Trump back in 2019, and on and on. What do all these organizations have in common? Well, they're not just U.S. recognized foreign terrorist organizations. Israel is literally at active war with all of them. And just to give a couple of concrete examples of this, last July in Lebanon, Israel took out a man by the name of Fuad Shakur. Who was Fuad Shakur? Fuad Shakur was the mastermind of the Beirut barracks bombing in 1983, backward when 241 Marines were tragically killed by Hezbollah. Hezbollah literally has more American blood on its hands than any Islamic terrorist organization other than Al-Qaeda because of 9/11, and arguably Iran itself due to IEDs on the side of the road during Iraq. So Israel took out Fuad Shakur, a terrorist that the State Department literally had a $5 million bounty on his head for decades. Israel did the exact same thing 2 months later when they took out Ibrahim Akil, also in Lebanon. He actually had a $7 million bounty on his head. Both of them where State Department recognized global specially designated organizations. You could say the same thing when Israel took out an Iranian Revolutionary Guard Corps commander by the name of Mohammad Reza Fazidi there next to the embassy in Damascus. This was 2 months after 3 Americans were killed tragically at Tower 22, the American base in Jordan. That man I just named, Mohammad Reza Fazidi, was the one who gave the order. So Israel is quite literally killing America's enemies for it. I don't see it as being much more complicated than that. That is the regional issue. Kind of then zooming out and looking at the global issue here. Because I'm a foreign policy realist, I know Dave likes to beat up on neocons, but I am very much not one of them. I am a true America national interest realist there. I recognize that America has dwindling resources in the world. I've actually been a skeptic of the war in Ukraine ever since day one, and I've repeatedly said, ever since my public career started, that America's #1 21st century geopolitical threat is China. The relevant question then is, how can the United States then strategically redeploy more assets to the Indo-Pacific to China, while still having an interest, as I just established that we do have, in the Middle East? The way to do that is to then pass the baton off to allies on the ground to, again, actually share your concrete interests and who have a military in place where they can actually effectuate those interests. This is the entirety of the Abraham Accords alliance that happened the first time around. You bring these allies together there to take care of the regional threat, in this particular case, Iran. So you get the Abraham Accords by bolstering Israel, as Donald Trump did there. That then in turn allows the U.S. to then focus on its true threat, China. Finally, there is the issue of global neoliberalism. We are in an age where there is a globalism nationalism dichotomy. My Emmy Foundation and Princeton alum Yoram Hazony wrote a book on this in 2018 there. If you care about the nation state, if you want to defeat the forces of globalism, whether they are in Foggy Bottom, Turtle Bay, the European Union, Klaus Schwab, the World Economic Forum in Davos, you have to care about the world's first nation state. The world's first nation state forum, when King David united the 12 tribes of Israel roughly 1,000 years before Christ was born. Israel is in the crosshairs of the globalists because it is the first nation state and because it is a deeply nationalist enterprise. If you care about nationalism, if you want to thwart the forces of subjugationist globalism, you have to go all in for U.S.-Israel relations.
Thank you, Josh. And now Dave's opening remarks.
Thank you to everybody for putting this on, and thank you, Josh, for coming to debate this most contentious and morally charged issue. I think it's a great thing to be able to debate these ideas rationally and calmly. And this is also my first time at Princeton. And actually, I got here early, so this is the most time I've ever spent at college. Pretty big day for me. Okay. The U.S. Israel very special relationship has been a disaster for the American people, including the millions of Jews amongst the American people. I would also argue that it's been a disaster for Israel's long-term interests, but that's outside the scope of this debate. Since we have these very short opening statements, I'm going to stick to 2 major points here that I think are the costs, or 2 of the costs associated with this relationship. Number 1, the terror wars. Okay, now it is just undeniable that Israel has a significant influence on U.S. foreign policy. I'm not making outlandish claims that they run our foreign policy or that there's some secret conspiracy. I'm saying very openly and very publicly, Israeli government and the Israeli lobby have been pushing for the war in Iraq, the war in Libya, the war in Syria, and essentially, aside from Afghanistan, the whole thing. This has been an unmitigated disaster for the United States of America, okay? It has cost us trillions and trillions of dollars, thousands of our bravest young boys' lives, tens of thousands, if you count the ones who blow their brains out at the aftermath of these wars. And at every point of this, Israel has been pushing for these wars. I mean, Netanyahu himself, the longest-serving prime minister in Israeli history, came to America and testified before our Congress in 2002 that we should go overthrow Saddam Hussein because that will have all of these positive reverberations around the region. In the same testimony, he also advocated that we overthrow Muammar Gaddafi in Libya, and he advocated that we go further and overthrow the mullahs in Iran. The entire time, they have been pushing us for more and more of these conflicts that have just been a disaster. Now, I'm sorry, if you look at the costs, and by the way, in these costs, I didn't even mention the millions of innocent people who have been killed in all of these wars. I'm sorry, look at those costs, and you tell me there's a benefit that outweighs that cost right there. You're not going to find it, okay? Number 2, and obviously we can get into a lot more of this when in the question and answer segment when we have time. Number 2, and I think this is a very important one to think about. For the scope of this debate, you don't even have to agree. Global opinion has turned harshly on Israel over this war in Gaza or the last nearly year and a half. Now, you could think that that's right or that that's wrong, but the point to this debate is that we now inherit all of that hatred around the world. And this is not the first time we've inherited this hatred, right? I mean, this really is at the core of the beef that we have with the Muslim world to begin with. It's at the core of why the terrorists hate our guts. You know, under George W. Bush during 9/11, what was the standard neocon line, right? The standard neocon line was that they hate us for our freedom. But even Michael Scheuer, the CIA head of the Bin Laden unit, himself admitted that that has nothing to do with why the terrorists hate us. And his exact quote was that only a fool wouldn't know that our relationship with Israel is why we have to fight wars with the Muslims. Now, this hatred that Israel has developed particularly over the last year and a half, where I think people see it all around us. I mean, the sentiment toward Israel has dramatically shifted to a point that would have been unthinkable a few generations ago. America now inherits all of that. We inherit that because it's our money and our weapons and our intelligence support that's allowing Israel to do what they do to Gaza. And everybody involved knows that. Everybody involved knows that this isn't really just Israel's war. This is a war that America is fighting, and it is not in our interest. We have no need to do this. Listen, if you had a friend, and every single night you went out to the bar with your friend, and every single night that friend was encouraging you to get into a fist fight at the bar, and you're just, okay, you're beating these guys up, but you're breaking your hands, and everybody around the bar is hating you now. And by the way, your own marriage is falling apart because you're out at the bar every night getting in fights. The answer is to stop hanging out with that guy. And in this case, the answer is to end the relationship, at least as it is currently working between the U.S. and Israel.
Thank you, Dave. Thank you, Josh, for your opening statements. It's now my pleasure to turn the moderated portion of the debate over to tonight's moderator, Tom Rogan.
Hi, you hear me? All right, good. Sorry for my tardiness. I had some flight issues. Anyway, good to be with you, gentlemen. Good to be with you all. So I suppose we can jump into the moderated discussion here. One of the things I'm curious about for both of you, and feel free to respond to each other's opening remarks. But for Josh, one of the things that I come back to on the national security side is that the United States, through provision of aid support, has been a stalwart Israeli ally traditionally, whatever you think maybe of the Biden administration, etc. But a thing that keeps coming up from the Pentagon and the intelligence community is that Israel had, under the first Trump administration, under the Obama administration, and to a lesser degree under the Biden administration, shared some very sensitive military technologies with China, even against American complaints. And then I would ask you, Dave, the contention that Israel is acting manifestly in its own interest against, or to the detriment of American interests. Isn't there a repudiation in to that argument in what we've seen recently with the pretty, astonishing successes of Israel in terms of decapitation of Lebanese Hezbollah? And the reason I mention that is a lot of the people the Israelis took out there were directly responsible for the Marine barracks bombings, which killed 241 Americans, the embassy annex attacks, other things that happened in the dark space of the espionage world. So why don't you start there, and then I'll go to Josh.
Okay, so look, I mean, I think there's no question that in this war, Israel has been incredibly successful by some military measures, or perhaps more special ops, if you're thinking about the pagers and taking out the Hezbollah guys there. I would also say that Israel, along with the United States of America, basically just completed what was a regime change in Syria. It was an attempted regime change that failed, that ultimately became successful. And we put, oh, am I cutting out here? Sorry. And we put al-Jilani in power. We put a member of al-Qaeda, the emir of al-Qaeda in Syria, in power, who was fighting in Fallujah against Americans. So again, I mean, look, I'm not saying that Israel hasn't killed any bad people there, but if you're looking at the net cost versus benefit, the fact is, while Israel may win in terms of intelligence and in terms of military, in terms of global opinion around the world, the cost that we're bearing is far outweighs any benefit.
Josh?
Well, first of all, Dave, we actually agree on al-Jilani in Syria. So, we're probably going to agree on a lot of these side issues. But I do feel a need to respond to two things in Dave's opening statement, and then, Tom, I'll respond to your question. So I think Dave said at least two things that really need to be responded to in his opening remarks. So I knew that Dave was going to pull the Bibi Netanyahu 2002 congressional testimony card. I've also watched that testimony in its entirety. It is true that Netanyahu testified in support of an Iraq invasion. So did roughly 90% or so of the United States Congress. But more to the point, Bibi Netanyahu was not in power in 2002. He was prime minister under Clinton in the late 90s. He came back into power under Barack Obama. The actual leader of the Israeli right at that time in 2002, prior to the disastrous disengagement from Gaza in 2005, was Ariel Sharon. Guess what Ariel Sharon's stance was on Iraq? He vociferously opposed it, and he told George W. Bush this in no uncertain terms. In fact, the Los Angeles Times had a very lengthy article, which I cite in chapter 6 of my book, talking about how a veritable procession of Israeli officials lobbied George W. Bush against the Iraq War because the Israeli mentality is actually typically just deal with the devil you know. That's actually why Hamas was in power for as long as they were there, and why most in Israel did not support toppling Bashar al-Assad, at least in recent years, because the mentality is really more just deal with the devil you know there. So that has to be responded to. The second thing is this broader notion that America is only at war with radicalists. I can't tell if my mic is on or not. I can't. This notion that America is only at war with radical Islam because of Israel. This too is also just demonstrably false. So after the American Revolution against the British, ending with General Cornwallis's surrender at Yorktown in 1780s there, America's first two wars literally after that were the Barbary Wars, the first and second Barbary Wars. It's funny how, like, when I was growing up in New York State there, I skipped over this. We went straight from the Revolutionary War to the War of 1812. America literally fought two wars against Muslim pirates there off the coast of Libya, Algeria, there in the southern Mediterranean Sea. More generally speaking, if I want to make a somewhat provocative statement, one might argue that large swaths of Islam have been at war with various elements of the West basically since Islam was founded. I'm not saying all of Islam is at war there, but it really doesn't take a PhD in history to be able to discern this. I mean, go back and read about the Crusades. Look at the fact that the flag of Saudi Arabia, which is a U.S. ally to this day, they have a sword, a literal sword there, which is a reference to the fact that in the early days of Islam, there was a lot of conquering there. So this notion that America is only at war with radical Islam due to Israel, I think is just a complete fabrication. Tom, to your question though about the U.S. intelligence and China and all that there. It is obviously true that there is no such thing as two countries in the world that share literally all the national interests. The United States doesn't share its entire national interest with Canada. I mean, Donald Trump and Justin Trudeau just proved that in real time there. So we obviously don't share 100% overlap with Israel. The China issue is actually a real concern. So Israel was considering having China build its port in Haifa, which is this major port there in northern Israel there. And a lot of people in Israel were very supportive of it. I was very critical of that because I'm an American. I don't want one of our close allies getting close to China. There obviously are going to be times where allies disagree. I happen, by the way, incidentally, maybe this will come up later a little bit more in the conversation. I actually oppose in the long term U.S. aid to Israel. This is where I really kind of make a lot of enemies, even in more pro-Israel circles there. I think it is in the long term benefit of both countries to get out of this mutual bear hug relationship. On the American side, it's a lot of money that just flows into the coffers of Boeing, Northrop Grumman, and defense contractors. And from Israel's perspective there, again, we're not debating that tonight, but from their perspective there, I think it undermines the entire point of Zionism in the first place, which is supposed to be the Jews' right to control their own destiny. It makes them too reliant on a foreign power, albeit it's us. But I think it's in both countries' interest to wind that down over the long term.
Can I respond to some of the, okay, so there's a lot. I agree with you about cutting the foreign aid to Israel, so I disagree with everything else. Okay, so just for a little background on this, okay? If you guys know, I'm sure a lot of you guys know, right? What has been so impactful on our foreign policy has been what's been dubbed the Netanyahu doctrine. It's also been called the clean break strategy. And it's also quite popularly referred to, as I'm sure some of you guys have heard, the toppling 7 countries in 5 years, which comes from General Wesley Clark. He, the 4-star general, said he had seen plans in late 2001 that we were going to take out 7 countries in 5 years. And if you're keeping track, I think all but Iran have either been attempted or succeeded at this point. Now, recently, General Wesley Clark, in a debate with Scott Horton on the Piers Morgan Uncensored program, revealed that actually it didn't start there, and that he had seen these plans 10 years earlier. And where did they come from? Paul Wolfowitz, when he was in power under in the George H.W. Bush administration. And he said that Scowcroft basically, who was the defense secretary at the time, basically said, let's deal with this after the election. He ended up losing the election. And then this was brought back to life when George W. Bush came into power. And after 9/11, they saw that as their opportunity to do this. The fact that Benjamin Netanyahu, the longest-serving prime minister in Israeli history, wasn't the prime minister in 2002 when he testified before Congress isn't really the point. And this detail about, listen, Sharon's guys, they didn't exactly oppose the war in Iraq. They didn't oppose overthrowing Saddam Hussein. What they opposed was doing it before you overthrow the Iranian government. They wanted George W. Bush to go after Iran first. And once they got assurances that Iran was coming next after Iraq, they kind of backed down and accepted that. Now, the neoconservatives in America have always been a little bit more aligned with Netanyahu and the Likud. I think Sharon and them had a split at one point. But they're essentially, it's very hard to keep up with what these guys really view, because the neocons are, at the same time, they're very comfortable lying, and they're also incredibly incompetent. So it's a weird mix, but it does seem to me that they really believed that Iraq was going to be a cakewalk, and that they were going to get the regime change in Iran after that, and that all of that 9/11 energy was going to carry over. Of course, it didn't work out that way, because Iraq was a quagmire, as could have easily been predicted and was predicted by basically every wise foreign policy leader. So that's just the stuff about the wars. And then, look, I'm sorry, but like, I've had this brought up to me in debates before, but to bring up the Barbary Wars as some type of point that, see, we've always been at war with the Muslims. Look, yes, there were some pirates who were demanding we pay them in order to have our ships pass through there.
They were just the Houthis from 200 years ago.
Okay, yes. In 1801, we had a conflict with some pilots, and Thomas Jefferson didn't much believe that, like, this is Thomas Jefferson we're talking about as president, so he's like, no free man should have to pay a bounty. The English and the French always just paid him off, so we launched these wars and spent way more money than we would have spent just paying off the pirates. Listen, if we want to just pick out points from history, I'd pick out this one, which I think is pretty interesting, okay? After World War I, there was the King Crane Commission. I don't know if any of you guys have looked into this, but it's actually really fascinating. And so there was this commission that went to basically the Ottoman Empire had collapsed. And so they went to basically do these massive surveys in what is today Syria, Israel, Palestine, and I think parts of Jordan. And they asked Syrian people, they interviewed tens of thousands of them, and they asked them who they wanted to rule Syria in a League of Nations mandate. And they overwhelmingly voted for America, because that was the attitude toward America at the time. We were seen as the city on a hill, the free country that doesn't try to dominate the rest of the world. They hated the British, they hated the French, and geez, I wonder why. Like, this isn't rocket science. And so, yes, listen, it's not just that people like the head of the Bin Laden unit at the CIA, or that, a bunch of people in the foreign policy establishment have all recognized this. You can also listen to the terrorists in their own words. And this doesn't mean you have to be sympathetic to them or be on the side of al-Qaeda, but they all say exactly what their beef is. And it is very much involved in our relationship with Israel, our military bases on their holy land, which also is there as a result of our relationship with Israel. And look, I'll just say this, and this will be my final point on this. After 9/11, the wisest member of George W. Bush's foreign policy team, Colin Powell, okay, now he still, even though he didn't want to fight the war in Iraq, he still went and lied through his teeth to sell the thing, so I'm not letting him off the hook for it, but he was a lot wiser than the other neocons that W had around him. The first thing he said to George W. Bush after 9/11 was, you got to do a two-state solution now. And why did he say that? It's not because he's a libertarian dove like me, and it's not because he's some harsh critic of Israel. It's just because he knows enough to know that this is the source of so much of the beef between America and the Muslim world. And ultimately, it was Tom DeLay in the House of Representatives who convinced George W. Bush that you will be a one-term president if you go for it, and he backed off.
Josh,
Can I ask Dave just a very simple question, actually? So you're making this repeated point about how the reason that the broader Islamic world hates us is because of our relationship with this tiny country. I'm not sure how much you've read about it, how the founding fathers viewed what they referred to as Mohammedism, but they did not have very pleasant thoughts, to put it mildly there. But my question to you is, you just referenced Osama bin Laden, that those letters to America went viral on TikTok, maybe a year and a half ago, whatever. Who do you trust more is giving you the truth when you listen to them? Osama bin Laden or Bibi Netanyahu?
I don't know. It's a weird question. I don't particularly trust either of them to give the
If you had to
truth.
choose,
I
because I
don't
think
know.
your answer will be quite telling, actually.
Well, I don't know. I mean, I don't even know exactly what that
You
means.
cannot tell whether you trust more the longest serving prime minister in Israeli history, who just got the warmest welcome any foreign leader's gotten in decades in DC last week, to the guy that you voted for president. On the one hand, it's him. On the other guy, it's the guy who killed more Americans than any single individual in American history. And you can't tell me who you actually trust more. But
Well, it's a different question than who do I think is a better person or like who killed more Americans. I don't trust either of them
Okay,
is
so
the answer. And Benjamin
let the record
Netanyahu has
reflect
been.
that he literally.
See, but this
he
is
can't
just
choose.
come on. This is like such a cheap
Dude,
tactic.
there's
to
a
it
simple
really
answer.
is. Oh yes, okay, fine. I mean, I don't know.
One
It's such a
orchestrated
it's such a
9/11, the
clunky,
other
weird.
did not.
Oh, okay, that is true. Yes.
okay.
One orchestrated 9/11 and the other did not. I agree with you on that. I mean, I think that Benjamin Netanyahu has been coming over here. You guys remember when he went to the UN with that Daffy Duck bomb and said that Iran was 5 years away from getting a nuke? Was he telling the truth when he said that?
I don't know what their intelligence
Okay,
shows.
exactly. So maybe he's not that
We've
trustworthy
had a lot of bad
of a guy.
intelligence
Maybe
ourselves.
the guy. Okay,
Intelligence
yes,
is
but the guy who's trying to lie us into wars constantly, I don't trust to tell the truth. And to say this thing about like, oh, him or Osama bin Laden, this is a false binary. You cannot trust either of them. That's
All right.
just fine.
I want to
So he did not
let's look
did,
at,
actually.
let's look at the contemporary environment, because one of the big challenges coming up will be, I hope this mic is working, the situation with Iran. The IAEA, the international community seem pretty collectively convinced that Iran is moving towards a potential breakout. That it's stopped. We know that Iran is stockpiling amounts of highly enriched uranium, or enriched uranium that is very close to weapons grade. So, gentlemen, I'm curious to you, because this would seem to be a great delineator in what is America's interest and Israel's interest, or perhaps the two countries' shared interest. Should the United States join an Israeli military action against Iran, which matters because there are a lot of military analysts who say Israel cannot do that to the degree that you would need to do without American capabilities, especially munitions. And if the United States shouldn't join that effort, is the price of a second Holocaust worth it?
Well, there's a lot of assumptions baked into that question. I would first say to your response, if it is true that Israel can't do it on its own, maybe Israel should stop threatening to do it constantly. Stop speaking for us. You know what I mean? Like if you're threatening a war, but you can't actually do it, so you're just out there, now you got like your kid brother out there saying he's gonna beat up everybody, but really relying on you to come fight for him. So that'd be my first thought. Stop talking such a big game, Netanyahu, if you can't actually do it, which I think is probably correct that he can't. Absolutely no. I mean, you'd have to have lost your mind to think after the last 25 years that we're going to embark on another war in the Middle East, this one that will be much more difficult than any of the previous ones that we've fought. I mean, if you think Iraq war was tough, trying to take out Iran is going to be a way more difficult battle. And no, it's not. Listen, if we don't want Iran to have a nuclear weapon, well, then I think we've been going about it all wrong. Of course, we've been pushing them toward that. And of course, the biggest blunder was what? Overthrowing Muammar Gaddafi after he had abandoned his nuclear ambitions and given up his chemical weapons to the international community. And then that guy ends up with, backed by the US and NATO, supported by Israel. This guy ends up being sodomized to death on the streets. I mean, that if that wasn't a signal to push every regime who wants what every single regime wants to survive, to push them toward at least thinking about it. Now, I will say that I don't think Iran is actually going to go for it. And you're right that they are getting closer to weapons grade. But at the same time, I don't think they could actually build a nuke without us knowing about it. And I don't think they have a death wish. And I don't think they would push it that far. But also, it's not it's not a given that if Iran did develop a nuclear weapon, they're going to use it. I mean, if Iran was truly suicidal, they could take a lot of more, they could take a lot of actions that they haven't taken so far. I don't believe that they're suicidal. And I also think that, yeah, I do agree more nuclear weapons tends to be bad. I'd rather have less. And it's pretty crazy that Israel gets to be the only country who has nukes and doesn't admit it.
And Josh, just before you answer this, I want to bake into the back and forth here. One of the concerns is not that Iran necessarily might be irrational in the moment that it had a nuclear weapon, but in the moment where the regime collapsed, which seems to be something that is increasingly likely, admittedly perhaps over a medium to long-term trajectory, then the revivalism of the Mahdi, or essentially, the Iranian regime's ideology might precipitate Ayatollah Khamenei, or probably his successor, to go out with a figurative and literal bang and use a nuke in that last gasp moment. But Josh, your response.
Yeah, so first of all, Dave and I agree on the issue of Gaddafi in Libya. You see, I'm really not this moralistic neocon or anything like that. I mean, the Gaddafi intervention during the Obama presidency was put out there by Samantha Power. It was this liberal internationalist Wilsonian doctrine of responsibility to protect. It's total garbage. There was literally only one reason and one reason only to justify military action anywhere else in the world, and that is necessary, truly necessary, because it is in your country's national interest. So all this moralistic stuff is totally garbage there. Now, I want to just tell a brief story. So I was in D.C. this past July. It actually was when Netanyahu was in town to give his speech before Congress, and I was speaking at a conference about this issue, about the issue of U.S. Israel relations and so forth there. And I saw this guy. This is a college age audience, and I saw this guy standing in the background, like very eccentric dressed guy, just like vigorously nodding along the whole time. So sure enough, I finished my remarks. He walks up to me. He grew up in Iran. He lived in Tehran until he was 16 years old, and then he moved to the United States. A young guy, so he grew up obviously in the aftermath of the Islamic Revolution of '79. There, he told me that ever since he was in kindergarten, pre-K, however far back you want to go, that their version of the Pledge of Allegiance in school, they get up, put their hand on their heart, is "I solemnly swear that I will do all that I can to destroy the little Satan of Israel and the great Satan of America." That they actually say that in schools there to this day. Now, over the years, Iran has shown over and over again that they actually have a keen interest in doing that. The death toll of American troops in Iraq due to Iranian supplied IEDs is at least 500, possibly as high as 1,000. That is why Donald Trump gave the kill order for Qasem Soleimani, the IRGC arch terrorist who was responsible for that, at the Baghdad, Iraq airport there in January of 2020 there. Moreover, as I said in my opening remarks, we saw at Tower 22, the U.S. base in the far corner of Jordan there, about a year ago, January 2024. That also was an instance of Iran directly attacking and murdering U.S. servicemen. They do this over and over and over again there. Sometimes through their proxies, Hezbollah and so forth there, but usually, oftentimes these days, through the regime itself. So I want to establish there, this actually is a regime that despises America. We can quibble what the reasons are there. I think Dave and I probably do not agree what the reasons are there, but they despise America and they genuinely seek to wish us harm. Indeed, they have done that successfully, tragically, many times over the past 4 to 5 decades there. As to the question of the Iranian nuclear program itself there, my extremely strong stance is that a military option is not necessary there. The Trump maximum pressure campaign the first time around had the regime very, very close to being on the brink there. Their economy was utterly teetering. Inflation was reaching decades high numbers there. every so often, it seems like the Iranian people actually are ready to make a move on the regime there. So my very, very, very strong preference would be to kind of keep that policy in place. Trump signed some executive orders last week when it came to doing exactly that. I am hopeful that will work out there. I ultimately do not think that American warplanes or anything like that should be dropping bombs on Tehran. That's not my stance. That's never, ever, ever been my stance.
So you would oppose it?
I think that if Israel determines, again, we're not debating this. We're not debating what Israel should do. It's a question about the United States. But if Israel determines that they have to take action, then the United States should obviously should support that, because again, this is a regime that literally tries to kill us there. But prophylactically, we should not be sending in the United States Airborne Division, whatever, to start dropping bombs on Tehran. And in the meantime, yes, we can and should make sure that in the short term that this ally has the tools that it needs to actually get the job done if it actually has to happen there, which again, my strong preference is that it does not.
Can I
Sure.
respond to
Yeah,
it?
very quickly. Yeah.
So, okay, well, first of all, what we are here to debate is the U.S. Israel relationship. And of course, this has been widely reported in the Times of Israel and Haaretz. There was a major piece in Time magazine about this last summer. But just to be clear, Josh may not be saying that America should overthrow the regime in Iran, but Israel is saying that. Okay, so like that's part of this relationship here, is that they very much do want us to attack Iran, and they've been pressuring us to for quite a while, but particularly since October 7th. The other thing I would say, look, I think sometimes we do get removed, and I know you don't like to, think of foreign policy in terms of morality. I actually do think that's an important thing to consider, but I do think it's like just how morally wrong it is to talk about how great it was when Donald Trump had the Iranian economy destroyed. I mean, what we're talking about here is not something that's hurting the government. This isn't something that's going to hurt the ruling class at all. They're still living in palaces. What you're talking about is poor people in a country far poorer than ours. People poorer than the poorest people you've ever met being driven either further into poverty. And then we turn around and wonder, why do they hate us so much? Why do they chant mean things about us in their school? I'll just say this, okay? This kind of this American foreign policy goal of sanctioning countries, of destroying their economy, of, like I said, pushing poor people further and further into poverty so that they will one day overthrow their regime, has never worked. It's never worked anywhere. It didn't work in Cuba, hasn't worked in North Korea, hasn't worked in Iran. The countries that we sanction the hardest, we do succeed in making their people suffer more.
It helped end apartheid in South Africa.
Okay. So we're going to go to questions from the audience. So if you haven't filed any with your phone or the chat or whatever it is, please do so. But this is a question for Josh. Besides cybersecurity and defense tools, what is the most prized, valuable resource that Israel provides to the U.S. that allows for the elevated special relationship?
What was the first thing you said, Tom?
But besides cybersecurity and defense tools, what is the most prized?
Cybersecurity and defense tools. Well, it's what I said in my opening remarks. I mean, they are quite literally killing people that have American blood on their hands. I mean, if you don't see the case for U.S. strategic relations after Israel literally took out Fuad Shakur, who once again had a $5 million bounty on his head for 4 decades since the Beirut barracks bombing, if you don't see the case for U.S. Israel relations after Israel took out Ibrahim Akil, who had a $7 million bounty on his head there. By the way, I don't think Israel's even cashed that check, which is fine. They get enough money as it is, so I'm not saying they need it. But I mean, if you don't see the basic strategic case for this country that is quite literally is killing people, that have killed hundreds and hundreds of Americans there, I mean, that to me, that is by far the number one thing that Israel does that redounds to the American national interest. They are quite literally doing our dirty work for us in a region of the world that, for better or for worse, America will always have a reason to care about there. And in so doing, will allow us, and Dave and I will probably agree on this, if you empower your allies to patrol the region in a way that redounds to your national interest, that will allow you to strategically retrench your own bases. The United States should not have bases in these far-flung provinces of Syria, Jordan. There, our troops are sitting ducks. What happened at Tower 22 in Jordan was overdue. We shouldn't be doing that there. The way to make sure you don't have that while preserving your interests is, again, to empower your allies to do the dirty work on the ground for you in a way that redounds to both of your country's interests.
Dave, a question for you. Israel is much more allied with many nations in the Arab world under Netanyahu than it ever was under previous left-wing Israeli governments. If Netanyahu is the cause of alienation of world opinion, explain the Abraham Accords and the de facto alliance of Israel with many other countries such as Saudi Arabia, under Netanyahu from John Soriano, Princeton 84.
I'm sorry, I missed one part of the question. If Netanyahu is what?
So the basic premise of the question: if Netanyahu is such a cause of alienation in world opinion, how do you explain the Abraham Accords? These deals with Arab governments that didn't happen under previous left-wing Israeli governments.
Sure. So look, I mean, we were a little pressed for time with the opening statements here, right? But this is the Netanyahu doctrine. That's the whole point. So if any of you have never read, I highly recommend go read it. It's a clean break, a new strategy for securing the realm. Okay, and this was written by Richard Pearl and David Wormser. Okay, now Richard Pearl later admitted, this was in 1996. It was written to Benjamin Netanyahu, okay? And basically, this is the whole strategy. Netanyahu had written a book on this previously, and he okayed the clean break strategy, but the document is fascinating. And so the entire strategy, right, was that the clean break was a break from Oslo, from the peace process. So for many years, and this was kind of more of the Yitzhak Rabin doctrine, the thinking generally was that, okay, Israel has occupied Gaza and the West Bank since 1967. The thinking was you can't do this forever. At a certain point, you have to give these people their autonomy, their liberty, okay? You can't just militarily occupy a group of people for longer than the Soviet Union occupied Eastern Europe. Well, okay, I guess you can, but the thinking was you're not supposed to. And so the old Yitzhak Rabin, broadly speaking, thinking was you have to make peace with the Palestinians. You have to come to an agreement where they can have their own state so that you can make peace with the broader Arab world. And the Netanyahu doctrine and the clean break strategy was to flip that and say, no, what we're going to do is overthrow all of the regimes that are giving us trouble in the broader Arab world, in the broader Muslim world, and then have the U.S. buy off the other ones. And so we can make peace with the surrounding countries so that we never have to give the Palestinians their own state. We never have to follow through on the peace process. We can just subjugate them forever. And so the Abraham Accords, I mean, I understand that you separate yourself from the neoconservatives, and I get that, granted. It's good that you're against the war in Libya and stuff like that. But this is still a continuation of that same foreign policy. The idea being that we could come in and bribe off all these other countries with U.S. taxpayer dollars, and then Israel doesn't have to make peace with the Palestinians. The result of that was October 7th.
Josh, you want to?
Okay, yeah. So I one comment, then I want to ask Dave a question there. So the comment is I can't just let this simply slide there. I knew that this would come up, this idea that there is a quote unquote occupation under international law of Judea and Samaria, aka the quote unquote West Bank. I've written tens of thousands of words on this very subject. This is simply not true under international law. So what happened after World War I? World War I came up earlier in the conversation there. After World War I, the European powers carve up the Middle East. You have the Sykes-Picot Agreement that Britain and France led the way on there, and you have the League of Nations, the predecessor to the United Nations, basically leading the charge with these various mandates. Part of the League of Nations was you had the British mandate for Palestine there. The British mandate for Palestine was then subsequently divided between the actual original two-state solution, which was mandatory Palestine, and the mandate for Transjordan. Mandatory Palestine was actually all of the land of Israel there, which included Judea and Samaria, included Gaza there. The mandate for Transjordan became Jordan there. That was actually the original two-state solution. So therefore, in 1948, when David Ben-Gurion declares independence in May of 48 there, under the international law doctrine of uti possidetis juris, Israel inherits the exact borders of the last sovereign or quasi-sovereign entity that existed in that part of the world there, that being the mandate for Palestine. Therefore, when Ben-Gurion declares independence in May of 48 there, it actually includes Judea and Samaria and Gaza. Now, Jordan illegally occupied Judea and Samaria for 19 years until the Six-Day War of 67 there, but Israel was never at any point there illegally occupying. I'm making a claim about law, by the way. I'm not necessarily arguing for one solution or the other as a political matter, but that had to be corrected as a matter of international law. Now, my question to Dave is basically the following there. You're saying here how you, unlike me, actually do take morality a little bit into account when it comes to foreign policy. Look, I'm being a little cheeky here. Obviously, at a certain point, it comes
Sure.
into being, right? Okay. You can always use like the Nazis, right? I mean, there's always examples, right? But generally speaking, I would say 95% of the time, if not higher, I genuinely do truly only look at the national interest. So let me ask you about these Sunni Arab Gulf states, Saudi Arabia, the UAE, Bahrain. There, these are not liberal democracies. You know, you don't have absolutist libertarian like free speech rights in Dubai. or in Riyadh, Saudi Arabia. There, the question for you is, do you care? Because when I'm thinking as an American here about foreign policy and how to form alliances in the world, I could not care less. I genuinely do not care if they are stoning people to death. I genuinely, frankly, do not care if they are doing public executions, if they have a very restrictive free speech right. All I care about is if what they are doing redounds to the American national interest. What say you?
I mean, it's a kind of strange question. I mean, I don't want to come off as like morally superior, but yeah, I do care. And I don't think that America should really be propping up regimes who commit horrific human rights abuses. Yeah, I do. I'd prefer they don't stone
I would
innocent
prefer that
people.
too, to be clear. I'm saying
Okay,
that's
so
not
what
how
do you
that's not
prefer?
how U.S. foreign policy should be driven in general.
Um, I mean, look, I don't know. I mean, I think that actually, yeah, probably we shouldn't support regimes that commit horrific human rights abuses, including Israel. And, you know, you can sit here and say that, like, the strategic benefit of Israel is that they've killed some bad people. It's like, yeah, I guess when you're killing that many people, you're going to hit some bad ones too, you know? But I actually do think that
Are you
that's,
familiar with the civilian to combatant death ratio in Gaza since the war launched?
no, and neither are you.
I am actually.
No, you're not. No one knows the exact civilian to combatant ratio. I know Israel pretends
Well,
to.
actually, well,
They make these
well, no.
assertions. This is how many guys we got in Hamas. Go look at the
It's
pictures
actually,
of Gaza,
it's
man.
actually,
They have destroyed
it's
this thing.
actually
It's
not.
going to be years. First of all, it's going to be years before we actually get an accurate figure of how many people died in this whole thing. There's going to be a ton of deaths from secondary and third, effects of the thing. You can't just destroy an area like this. I know Donald Trump has this plan now to help Israel ethnically cleanse all the
All
Palestinians.
right, let's
out
get
of there.
Josh in.
But I'm just saying that no, we don't know what the combatant.
Well, funny enough, I
ratio
actually
is.
I work in Newsweek, and we published a guy by the name of John Spencer at least 5 to 10 times since October 7th started. John Spencer is the head of the Urban War Studies Department at West Point. He is the Western world's singular leading expert when it comes to issues of urban war. He actually was on the ground in Fallujah there in 2016 during the ISIS counterinsurgency. I'm not even sure who you might alternatively suggest to be the alternative leading expert when it comes to urban warfare. Guy has literally studied urban warfare since there was such thing as cities, as urban stuff in general there. And he has repeatedly crunched numbers and shown that the civilian to combatant death ratio in Gaza since October 7th is very close to 1-to-1. At one point it was 1.5-to-1 there. It's roughly 1-to-1. This dwarfs by orders of magnitude what even the United States was able to achieve in Fallujah there during the counterinsurgency. He has said repeatedly, that the propaganda, the lies, the smears, the blood libels notwithstanding there, that what Israel has done since October 7th is fight the most moral war in an urban setting in the entire history of urban warfare there. It is a miracle of biblical proportions.
I want to get onto another question here, just because we want to honor the audience.
Okay, just a very, very quick, like just to say that Israel's fought the most moral war. Look, Israel has had, you don't want to say it's an occupation. Israel has occupied or blockaded / controlled Gaza since 1967.
Okay.
They're essentially doing this to their own people.
Right.
It is one of the most evil wars in human history.
All right. Well, let's. So we're coming back to the premise of the question: American interest and Israeli interest. Sure. We have a lot of questions here on the role of APAC, whether APAC is. So I guess let's put this question forward to both of you. Does APAC serve American interests or is Israeli interests more? Who's the beneficiary predominantly from that? Because APAC would say it's serving American interests ultimately.
Yeah, and so would all of the neoconservatives would have said that they're serving both of their interests because they both align. But I don't think, again, from my perspective, I don't think they're serving either. If we're talking about this is like basic public choice theory stuff, right? Like there is no real, it's not always so clear that this is in the people's interest. Powerful people make decisions that are in the powerful's interest. And sometimes powerful people make decisions that aren't even in the powerful class's interest. It's just in their own interest. Think Joe Biden not dropping out of the race. Sometimes people just make decisions in their own interest. I think obviously APAC is working toward what they see as in Israel's interest. I think it's not in Israel's long-term interest, and it's certainly not in America's interest.
Okay, Josh.
All right, so two things real quick. One is there's a supply and demand side to this equation. So the question is, does APAC exist because there's some nefarious supplier in Tel Aviv, or does APAC exist because, again, as the American Israeli Political Action Committee, there are a lot of Americans who care about this issue, the same way that the NRA exists because a lot of people own guns and love guns. Heck, I'm one of them. I mean, so that is part of the issue, and Israel still to this day is an overwhelmingly popular cause among the American people there. So I think it's worth pointing that out at first there. I happen to be a skeptic of APAC. I've never been a fan of APAC, literally ever. I think I gave them $54 once because I was coerced to go into this dinner I didn't want to go to. It's a long story, but I'm not a fan.
Welcome to Washington.
Yeah, right, exactly. Actually, it was in Houston, Texas, but
Okay.
neither here nor there. I'm not a fan of APAC for one very simple reason, which is that APAC's raison d'etre, their entire reason for existing, something that I actually oppose, as discussed earlier, which is getting in these decennial, these every 10-year memoranda of understanding. So if I oppose that as a matter of principle, which I do, I'm not saying cut the spigot off tomorrow or today, but in principle, I oppose them. I think it's bad for America. I think it's bad for Israel there. Why would I support APAC, whose literal reason for existing is to do that? APAC also has this whole bipartisan thing going on where they've deliberately worked behind the scenes to water down Republican initiated pro-Israel legislation to try to make sure it gets bipartisan recognition there. So APAC is a bunch of wussies. Not a fan of them at all, actually.
I'll just.
Dave, I'm just going to give you my mic.
Is this not?
Yeah,
Is this not
you're
working?
struggling a bit.
Okay. So, well, should I take this off then?
Yeah, you
Or
might
is
as
that-
well, yeah.
Okay. Yeah. So I'm not like coming in and out part of the time. Okay. So I would just point this out, right? There's every U.S. president of my lifetime, with think the exception of Donald Trump, every single U.S. president of my lifetime has wanted a two-state solution. Every one of them. They've been very clear about that. None of them can get it done. None of them have been able to get it done. And this is in large part due to APAC. Now, I do agree with Josh. It is undeniably the case that there are a lot of Americans, you know, between Jewish Americans and evangelical Christians, there's a lot of Americans who very much do want to support Israel. But it's also the fact that lobbies exist for a reason. And it's almost like if it was just the case that the American people supported Israel anyway, and APAC had no influence, then they wouldn't exist. They exist because they have an effect on these things. And APAC and the
They
Israel
lost the
lobby
Iran
more
deal
broad.
pretty badly.
Yeah, that is, that
That's
is
like their
true.
biggest loss ever.
Yeah, and they won the Iraq War, the war in Libya, the war in Syria, you know? So yeah, they lost that. Obama made a deal to prevent a war with Iran when the war, just for logistical
What war
reasons,
in
was
Syria?
off the
The US
table.
not gotten, what exactly are you referring to?
Operation Timber Sycamore, the backing of the anti-Assad rebels. You know, by the way, even before, because I meant to respond to this, isn't it? It's funny because you classified the war in Libya as kind of like a liberal human rights type adventurism thing. Well,
Responsibility to protect Samantha Power doctrine.
Right. It's an awful coincidence that I got a 4-star general named Wesley Clark who tells me in 1991, Paul Wolfowitz had a plan to overthrow all of these regimes, and those happen to be the exact ones. Isn't that something? Wouldn't that be? And it happened to always be justified because, oh my God, Gaddafi's about to go genocidal. No, he wasn't. Oh my God, Bashar al-Assad is killing all of his own people. And then later after that, you find out that America and Israel were arming all the anti-Assad rebels, and much of the weapons ended up in the hands of Al-Qaeda and ISIS. And so, yes, that I would consider that another war. And look, as soon as Donald Trump, 2017, turned that program off, stopped arming the anti-Assad rebels, the killing stopped. Things calmed down. You know, it was the U.S. plan for regime change in Syria is what kicked off that whole civil war to begin with.
I didn't support any of that, so I'm not sure what point you're trying to.
Okay, so let's go on to another question here. In light of anti-BDS legislation, and you could argue controversy over the adoption of the international forget the name, the anti-Semitic IRA, yeah, right, anti-Semitic judgment in terms of how colleges approach speech issues related to Israel, Judaism, etc., anti-Semitism. Has the special relationship with Israel had a deleterious effect on Americans' right to free expression? Josh, do you want to start on that?
The answer is no, properly construed. So, Tom, I'm also a lawyer, and free speech in the Anglo-American jurisprudential tradition doesn't actually mean what a lot of liberals and libertarians think that it means. I mean, you can go back all the way, and this is This is going to ruffle some feathers here, but I will walk you through the history. You can literally go back to the English common law to the American founding there. Back at the time of the American founding there, such things as pornography, blasphemy, obscenity there were all completely verboten. If you were to do any of these things, you would probably be more likely to be tarred and feathered in the public square rather than to kind of walk into court or take your horse and buggy into court and have your First Amendment free speech rights upheld. That's simply not how the First Amendment works. There are obvious limits on the First Amendment there. But the BDS campaign actually has nothing to do with the First Amendment, Tom, because the BDS campaign has nothing to do with free speech rights. It has solely to do with corporate activity there. It's actually simply enforcing the anti-boycott laws back from the 1970s there, and saying that you cannot discriminate against certain individuals there when it comes to who you are choosing to engage it with as a matter of contractual rights. It is limiting commercial activity there and saying that state-supported taxpayer institutions. I'm thinking here of like the South Carolina law that Nikki Haley led back in 2015. I think she was the first one there. Not a huge fan of Nikki Haley, incidentally. But this law that she passed, Texas was then a model state afterwards there. It's putting limits on who taxpayer monies the government contractors can then engage in contract.
What about IRA though? IRA is slightly different, right? The definition in terms of how speech, certain things related to Israel.
Yeah, so the IRA definition, this was really kind of brought to the forefront in 2019 when Donald Trump signed his landmark Title VI executive order. Okay, so he adopted the IRA definition. IRA stands for International Holocaust Remembrance Alliance. This is an organization that was started years ago by a bunch of primarily liberal-leaning academics. So it's not necessarily my kind of visceral home, I guess you would say there. But they are correct insofar as the most controversial part of this definition is concerned, which is the notion that anti-Zionism is ipso facto is necessarily anti-Semitism. It is, with one exception that I'm always willing to grant there. If you are a true kind of George Soros globalist and you actually do not believe in the nation state and you literally want to abolish every single nation state ever, then I'm not going to call you an anti-Semite for including Israel in your 200 plus countries of the world there. But assuming that you're not, because very few people have that actual stance there, then if you actually believe that there is only one state that should not exist, and oh, by the way, it happens to be the Jewish state, and by the way, that's what anti-Zionism is. You want to criticize the Israeli government? Go right ahead. I do it all the time there. That's not anti-Zionism. Anti-Zionism is literally calling for the eradication. It's saying that there is one group of people in the world, not the Italians, not the Peruvians, not the Japanese, not the Singaporeans or whatever. There's one group of people who do not have the right to their own self-determination in their own ancestral homeland there. That actually is, that singling out there, that is 100% anti-Semitism. And to that extent, IRA is correct to include that. Donald Trump was correct to put that into effect with his Title VI statute or his Title VI executive order back in 2019.
I just really wanted to agree with you about not liking Nikki Haley and George Soros. But look, I mean, I find this a lot in like kind of the broader Israel-Palestine debate, but it's just so wild to me to hear someone on the pro-Israel side of the debate invoke the idea that there's one group of people who don't get their right to a state. Isn't that so horrible? And who is it? The ones who have a state. The ones who get unconditional support from the biggest, most powerful government in the history of the world, get more foreign and military support than any other country we've ever given it to. I mean, if it's such a horrible thing that some people believe Israel doesn't have a right to a state, I'll tell you something that's even more horrible. The Palestinians never having one. I mean, like, anyway, look, as far as all of these, look, I'm not, as I said earlier, I'm not for sanctions. Boycotting and divesting, I think, is everybody's natural right to do. But really more beyond that, and maybe this actually could be an area of agreement. I don't know. Tell me, maybe I'm wrong about this, but I think Josh might agree with me on this. I think that the words bigotry or racism or anti-Semitism or homophobia should never come out of a politician's mouth in a professed free society. It is none of your business. I'm a free American and I'll feel however I feel. I don't like people who hating Jews. You know, I don't like it, but they have a right to do that. And I just hate the idea that there'll be any type of like response from the Congress over what people are saying. Look, if there's one thing that's been the best thing about America over the last few months is that all that woke nonsense has been rejected, you know, and like, let's move on from all of that. Enough calling people bigots because they disagree with you on an issue. And if you haven't noticed, it just creates more of it. it just pushes people more and more into that direction. That's not how you bring people away from that, if that is your goal.
Okay, so another question here. If the United States used maximum pressure, because there have been a lot of questions on the idea of the future peace settlement or status quo or whatever it might be, if the United States used maximum pressure to force a two-state solution, would that be a benefit for US foreign policy in the region or a detriment? Would that bolster or degrade the strategic alliance between the US and Israel over the long term? Josh, do you want to start on that?
All right, yeah. So the short answer, as I already said earlier, is that there already is a Palestinian state. It's called Jordan. You know, it's worth pointing out that there has literally never, ever, ever, ever been an independent Arab state referred to as Palestine or anything like that in that part of the world between the river and the sea, as the Hamasniks like to tell us. In fact, what happened was after the destruction of the Second Temple in the year 70 of the Common Era, it was actually the Romans who tried to de-Judaize Judea by referring to it as Palestine, and that was a name that kind of stuck for centuries and centuries. But nonetheless, there was literally always a Jewish population there in the land of Israel. It was called the Ishuv in the centuries before the founding of the state of Israel in 1948. In fact, if you actually go back and look at the photos and look at the scorecards of the 1930s Palestinian soccer team there, you'll see their uniforms have a very familiar symbol. It's the Jewish star there, and their names are names like Solomson and Finkelstein and Cohen there. That was the Palestinian soccer team. In fact, my wife's grandmother, may her memory be a blessing, was actually born in the land of Israel back before Israel was a state, back in 1941. Incidentally, no, she was not a European colonizer. She was actually Iraqi. She was kicked out of there by the local Arabs there. So she was born there in 1941 in Palestine. She had a Palestinian passport there. So then the relevant question, then fast forwarding, because the Palestinian Information Operation, which was basically launched by Yasser Arafat and the Kremlin in 1965, was essentially a Soviet Cold War information operation to try to dilute American geopolitical influence in that part of the world. That literally is actually the source of this information operation there. It goes back to the 1960s and the Kennedy presidency, Johnson, the Cold War, all of that there. The question then fast forwarding to today is any American national interest literally what so freaking ever served by granting recognition of a 23rd Arab state, because apparently 22 are not enough already? And the answer is obviously no. There is no national interest literally whatsoever. None. That is served by creating a brand new state by a population. That, to just take one example there, the Palestinians in November of 2023, in one reputable poll based out of Ramallah, the head of the Palestinian Authority there, this poll showed that 75% of Palestinian Arabs that it polled supported October 7th. The Al-Qassam brigades, the militant wing of Hamas, the whole organization is pretty militant, but this is the most militant there, had an 86% approval rating. What national interest for the United States is served by granting these people a state, the same people that just killed between 30 and 40 Americans on October 7th, that are still holding American citizens hostage? There is no compelling national interest from an America perspective whatsoever there. It is far, far better to actually bolster your ally, which again shares your interest there in the Middle East.
So I've found with this topic of Israel Palestine more broadly that so much of it always comes down to the framing. And you notice things like, you make the point that there was never a Palestinian state. Then when you're talking about the Jews, you say there was always a Jewish population. So like, which one is it that counts? You know, before 1948, there wasn't a Jewish state there either. And you could say, oh, there's 22 Arab states. Why do they need?
There actually was, if you want to go back 2,000 years.
Yeah, okay, so for 2,000 years there wasn't. So sure, okay. But what does that mean? But the point is that, I mean, to me, that's not really what matters. What matters is that there's a people there. You know, like there's the number, should there be 22 Arab states or 23 Arab states or 0 Arab states or 1,000 Arab states? I don't know how many European states there should be. Well, I think the best part of Western civilization is that the belief, at least in theory, is supposed to be we believe in self-determination. So
Yeah,
essentially,
that's literally why.
no,
Jordan
all right.
is
Well,
the
let me.
country.
Okay, let me just respond here. So there's the idea is that, and this is right out of just the Bill of Rights, excuse me, of the Declaration of Independence, right? Just read the first few sentences of the Declaration of Independence, and it basically just says, we determine that it's self-evident that God wants us to be free. And nation states are just a thing that people create in order to protect our freedom. And if we don't like it, we can get rid of it, and maybe we even have the duty to get rid of it and create a new one. And so the point isn't how many Arab states there are. The point is, just like with the Jews, there's a population there. And the people in the Palestinians in the West Bank and in Gaza deserve their natural rights as much as anybody else. Now, back to the more specifically the topic of the debate. Look, I think there's a bit of almost circular reasoning here when you say that, well, look, why would we want to give these people a state? Because right now they hate Israel so much. But the point is, right now, they're completely dominated by Israel and have been forever. And you know, by the way, like even historically during the peace process, when the peace process was making some amount of progress, or at least it seemed like it might be, support for militant-style Hamas members would go down. And then when the peace process collapsed, support for them would go up. And so the reason why it would be in America's strategic interest is that, look, you can cite any of these opinion polls and say, look, there's a large percentage of the people in Palestine who support, you know, the atrocities committed on October 7th. There's also a large percentage of Israelis who have supported many atrocities against the Palestinians. No, I'm not saying any of that's good, but look, okay, let me just finish this.
It's not true though. Like,
It is.
It's not. There's no polling to back up what you just said. None.
That the war has not been popular.
The war, yes.
Right. Well, that's the atrocities, man. I mean, yeah.
Okay.
That's I'm saying. That's okay.
All right. Let's wrap it up because we have to go to.
Okay, fine. Well, I'm just going to say this. Look, Germany and France are next to each other, right? Ireland and England. There are these countries that used to be like in really, really bad spots that are now kind of cool. And the point is that it is possible that maybe if we settled this question once and for all with a two-state solution, we could potentially
We literally
get there.
had that. It's called the Sykes-Picot Agreement of 1920. Jordan is that state.
No, it's not. It's totally different. We're talking about the people who live in the West Bank, the Palestinians who live in the West Bank, and the Palestinians who live in Gaza having their own state right now, not being dominated by Israel. We do not have that right now.
All right. At that point, I'm going to ask the audience, while you're listening to the closing statements, please be ready to file your post-debate response. So whether your attitude has changed on the motion. But Josh, do you want to start us off with your closing remarks? You have 5 minutes.
Okay. First of all, just to wrap up what we were just saying here. So there was a PLO official by the name of Zuhair Musin who famously said in 1977 that this entire idea that we distinguish between Jordanians, Lebanese, Syrians, Palestinians there is a lie. It is only done in service of the destruction of Israel. Yasser Arafat said the exact same thing 3 years prior in 1974. So they've been very clear about this since the get-go. The entire idea of Palestinian Arab nationalism literally exists to ultimately destroy Israel and to massacre the Jews of Israel. But getting back to our resolution here when it comes to U.S. strategic relations there, I would just reiterate some of the points that I made at the outset. First of all, America is always going to have an interest in the Middle East, for better or for worse. Maybe it's better that they wouldn't, but for better or for worse, we are always going to have an interest in a part of the world where there are things such as the Bab al-Mandab Strait, such as the Strait of Hormuz there, through which shockingly high percentage of the world's commerce flows, where there is abundant natural gas and oil there, and where radical Islamic terrorism is a threat. The relevant question, if you, like me, are a China-first foreign policy person, you actually care about America's dwindling military recruitment, our dwindling ability to actually fight wars overseas, military readiness, preparedness there. If you, like me, want to make sure that we are actually adequately focused on the Indo-Pacific there, the relevant question becomes, how do you secure your interests in the Middle East in the mid to long term in a way that allows you to retrench your resources? And the answer is the Abraham Accords model of statecraft and diplomacy that Donald Trump and Bibi Netanyahu were able to orchestrate the first time that Donald Trump was in power. The way to do that is you go all in for U.S. Israel relations. You go all in for Israeli rapprochement with the more moderate Sunni Arab states. God willing, Saudi Arabia will join sooner rather than later there. And this creates an Iran containment alliance that then in turn allows the United States to pull back and then focus on its true civilizational threat, which is the Chinese Communist Party there in the Far East. Again, target assassinations that Israel has done of people like Fuad Shakur, Ibrahim Akil, who have the Beirut barracks bombings and the Beirut embassy bombings, both in 1983. They have those blood on their hands there. Israel pulled it off there. They're not asking for anything other than just to not hate them. It is a relatively small price to pay. And then kind of just to get back then to the broader point here as far as the civilizational war that we are in. So in my book out next month, again, you should pre-order today, shameless plug, Israel and Civilization, the Fate of the Jewish Nation, the Destiny of the West. I essentially argue that only a Jewish-Christian alliance is capable of withstanding the three hegemonic forces that seek to destroy us, which are in no particular order: wokeism, Islamism, and global neoliberalism. The idea here, the broader point, is that contra the John Stuart Mill harm principle, classical liberalism, libertarianism, values neutrality shtick, you actually have to believe in something. If you want to rally your proverbial troops to a cause, to defend your inheritance, to defend your civilization, you actually have to stand for something. Otherwise, people will be attracted to the alternative moral argument, even if it is an immoral argument like wokeism, Islamism, and so forth there. That's something. When it comes to what the West should stand for there, is the Bible. Is the Bible itself there? Biblical values, whether you realize it or not, is what created Western civilization. The golden rule, treat others as you want to be treated there, it actually is right there in the book of Leviticus, chapter 19, if memory serves there. This entire idea of federalism, localism, that constitutional law people like to think was an American innovation there, it's actually right out of the book of Jeremiah. Focus on the welfare of your cities. So much of what we take for granted today comes downstream of what the Jews and Christians have done for Western civilization there. And for that reason, as well as what I said in my initial opening remarks, this idea that if you care about the globalism versus nationalism, nation-state dichotomy as well, if you actually defend the post-1648 Westphalian nation-state system, if you believe in such things as national sovereignty, if you oppose the forces of globalism, whether it comes from Klaus Schwab and the World Economic Forum, whether it comes from Brussels or Turtle Bay, the United Nations there, if you actually believe in the inherent value of the nation-state there, you have an obligation. You have an obligation to care about the world's first nation state. Back in classical antiquity, when David united the tribes of Israel in Jerusalem, that was actually in contrast to the Roman Empire model of imperialism. Israel basically gave the world, in many ways, the nation state there. And if you think that they're going to stop with Israel, the globalists win there, that they're not going to just march on to Europe, try to eradicate borders there to the extent that the borders are not firmly eradicated, they're going to march on to the Americas there, you have to draw a firm line in the sand. So for all of these reasons, when it comes to counterterrorism, people like Fuad Shakir and Ibrahim Akil, Hezbollah, IRGC, Palestinian Islamic Jihad, Kataib, Hezbollah, all of the entire alphabet soup of terrorists that Israel is killing that are literally U.S. State Department recognized foreign terrorist organizations, whether it's the Abraham Accords and the China realignment in the Indo-Pacific, or whether it is this broader civilizational battle, it all comes down in many ways, not always, but in many ways, to support for this tiny country in the Middle East, and that necessitates U.S.-Israel relations.
Thank you, Josh. Oh, sorry, Dave.
That's cool. You know, I just find it, maybe it's just me, I find it so wild to like brag about the Abraham Accords being this huge success. And I understand, like, okay, it doesn't necessarily logically follow that because the Abraham Accords were put into place and then there's such a disaster in the Middle East afterward that doesn't prove that it's causal, that it's because of that there's such a disaster. But it's kind of like if you were like, dude, I got into couples counseling. It's the best thing that could possibly happen. We have the best therapist, just amazing. That's the model you got to follow. And you were like, oh, great. How are you and the wife doing? And go, oh, we split up. Horrible divorce. It's like, well, then it's weird to brag about the thing that happened right before this disaster. Look, I mean, to kind of zoom out on the debate, as I know Josh kind of reiterated some of the stuff he talked about in his opening statement, I just think that the costs that I laid out in my opening statement are so much greater than the benefits that he's laying out. And really, Josh is only, like, I think the only time he really addressed the argument was to say that Sharon's envoy wasn't for the war in Iraq. But really, again, as I pointed out, it's just not a complete history. The truth is that they wanted to overthrow Saddam Hussein. They were just a little bit smarter than the neocons and Netanyahu, who understand that you'd be handing the region to Iran if you just overthrew Saddam Hussein first. And then they ultimately backed off when they thought they would get that regime change right afterward. The fact of the matter, and this is just undeniable, is that Israel and the Israel lobby have significant influence on America. And they have used that influence to push toward these disastrous wars that have cost us trillions of dollars and millions of innocent people have been killed. And I'm sorry, there's just no benefit that outweighs that cost. You say what you want to about this vague, we'll always have an interest in the Middle East, and that there are some straits where we like to do trade. Like, oh, okay, we could figure that out in a way that doesn't involve these astronomical costs and isn't turning global opinion so strongly against us. And listen, I say this as a Jewish person, I say this as a person who doesn't want to see a rise in hatred of Judaism, who doesn't want to see bad things happen to innocent people in Israel. Read the room. I mean, there is a huge generational gap here. The younger people who are coming up, they're going to be the adults in the room pretty soon, and they do not have the same attitudes about Israel that the older generation does. And this is something that really threatens the future of both Israel and the United States of America. And the fact is that in today's modern day, with the social media and everything that you can see online, when you can see images of what's being done to Gaza, you just can't get away with a war like this without turning the entire world against you. And so I think it is very clear that the costs of this relationship have outweighed the benefits, and I think it's very clear that it would be in America's interest to simply not embark on this. And the other point that I made earlier that I don't think was ever, I mean, I guess Josh did respond to it, but I just don't think he's right about this, is that, again, it is very clearly at the center of why we had to deal with this terrorism problem to begin with, is this relationship. You know, Osama bin Laden, it's not just his letter to America that did go viral and got a kind of strange reaction from young leftists on TikTok, but in both his declarations of war against the United States of America, he laid it out very clearly. And this isn't, again, you know, the question was asked at one point, who I trust, Osama bin Laden or Benjamin Netanyahu, and I guess you think it indicates something that I said neither of them. Certainly, I would argue that Osama bin Laden is an enemy of the American people in a way that Netanyahu isn't. You know, if you were taken from the Palestinian side, you might have a little bit of a different, you know, understanding of who's the worst guy there. But it's not even necessary. I'm not saying Osama bin Laden was being honest necessarily when he said, you know, why do we attack you? Because you attack us. But just think about it like this. What's really going to get somebody to put on a suicide vest? What's really going to get somebody to go and sacrifice their own lives just to take out some other people? And it's going to be a little bit more than, oh, the women over there have miniskirts and they have the right to own shotguns. And it seems a lot more reasonable that if you just saw one of your friend's kids or your sister killed, that would make you want to go do that. And if we don't grapple with that, we do that at our own peril. This relationship has been a disaster for the United States of America, and we should get out of it immediately, yesterday. All right, thank you guys very much.
On that fine note, gentlemen, thank you very much. Josh and Dave, appreciate it. And I want to thank the audience as well for living up to the finest traditions of being respectful and engaged. But let's have the pre and post debate poll put up on the page. All right, so it looks like the motion has been defeated with an increased majority. So I guess congratulations to Dave, but both panelists obviously did a wonderful job. Hadley, over to you.
Yes, thanks, Tom. Thanks, everyone, for coming out tonight. Thank you especially to Tom and Dave and Josh, who made this debate successful and demonstrated how civil discourse is so important on this issue and so many others. I really appreciate the Princeton Open Campus Coalition and Princetonians for Free Speech for being part of this evening with us. I want to invite all of you to visit steamboatinstitute.org. You can catch the video of this debate and share it after the fact. And I also want to invite everyone here to step into the next room where we have some pizza, and we'd love to continue the conversation. So thank you and have a great night.
This is all done.
Great.